Thank you so much for being here. My first question, I guess, is about the current regulatory attempts that the EU is trying to have. So as we all know, the EU is discussing regulating technologies such as facial recognition. And I guess the main issue with this sort of technologies is that also developing very fast. So I was wondering, how do you feel about, let's say, the time-proofness of such technologies and the regulations? Do you believe that the EU is able to create some regulations that could become a long-standing standard for years to come, or will they already have some issues in a few years?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. The challenges are very real, especially because these kinds of new technologies, we don't have a lot of experience in how they are actually being used, what kind of impacts they are having on people. And so it makes it difficult to properly identify what is proportionate in this space. The approach that the EU is taking is one to say, don't focus on the technical aspects so much, but rather focus on the intended use. The idea behind this is that ultimately what you're looking to protect is the rights of people, and the rights of people are a right to privacy, a right to having control over your own life, and whether or not this right is being impacted by a particular technology or by the way in which an organization operates is ultimately not really that important. What is important is protecting the rights of the people. And so the idea is to focus on the intended use of the system, to define the technology in quite a broad way so that new technologies won't easily fall outside of that kind of scope, and to include within this process something where there will be frequent updates to the definitions of what constitutes high risk or not, and that these definitions are updated based on what is being observed, so monitoring of how these technologies are being used. And from the implementation side, what it is that a company needs to do in order to show that they're compliant with the regulation, a lot of that is being put on harmonized standards. So that is standards, this is guidance process of the processes to follow, which is developed by the technical community and then approved by the European Commission, which can be updated as the technology develops. As such, I think the approach is an appropriate approach to take. As always, the biggest challenge is really in implementing this, for instance, by making sure that the supervisory organizations, the regulators, actually have the skills and the manpower in order to actually implement the oversight.
Thank you. And do you believe that it is sufficient to have strong regulations only at the European level, or do you believe that we should try and aim for a more global standard in terms of regulation? Because I guess many of the companies that you also mentioned, these are multinational companies, and maybe American companies or Chinese companies. So perhaps it could be argued that it might be a better idea to just not only focus on the EU level, but at the more global level as well.
Absolutely, and I think it is recognized that these technologies are largely used at a kind of global scale. They gain a lot of their advantage over doing things in a manual kind of way by doing it at scale. We see that there is a lot of effort being placed, for instance, through the OECD, through the new organization, the Global Partnership on AI, as well as at the UN, to coordinate the way in which these kinds of technologies are being regulated. The challenge, of course, is that in the details, the culture of a particular region comes into this. So if we say a technology should recognize the autonomy of people, what do we actually mean with autonomy of people? If we say there's the right to privacy, how do we define privacy relative to the way in which company uses the data or relative to the way in which government uses the data? These are things where culturally there are differences between different regions, not just between the West and China, but also between Europe and the US, for instance, which is why we will find that a lot of the sort of detailed level of how to implement these regulations is going to have to be at the more local kind of level. But there is an effort being made to coordinate how these are being done. And of course, the EU is, for instance, applying the same kind of extraterritorial reach to its AI regulation as it did with GDPR, in order to avoid that the regulation can be circumvented simply by running your AI system on a server that is based in the US instead of in Europe.
Thank you. And I was wondering, because you do mention, I guess, these efforts are currently being made, and I was wondering, because I feel like many people might fear that perhaps we're moving a bit too slow with regulating this, or maybe it's already a bit too late, considering also how fast this technology has been developed. What is your opinion on this? Do you think it is a bit too late already to regulate, or is there still hope to try and accomplish something in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
It's actually an interesting kind of dilemma, at which point to start regulating something. As I mentioned, when it comes to future proofing, we are challenged because the technology hasn't been used much. We don't even know exactly where the specific challenges or the specific concerns should lie. So you can't really start regulating before you know what the problem is, but you don't want to allow the problem to become so integrated that it can no longer be really dealt with before we start regulating. In a sense, actually, we have started regulating, or at least thinking about regulating, of AI technologies, including face recognition, in a way earlier than we did with a lot of other kinds of technologies. But I would say it's sort of the right kind of time. The technologies have matured to the point where we can see how they are going to get used, the potential uses. They haven't really been implemented at the kind of scale yet. When we hear that a new kind of technology has been built or is coming out, often there's a bit of a sense that it's being used more than it really is. A lot of companies, for instance, have been doing pilot studies on how to use AI technologies for automating various things, but only a small percentage of those have actually translated into operational use. So the way in which AI is being actually used is actually less than potentially what most people might be thinking at this moment. Which is not to say that that it's too early. This is the right time to start regulating, especially as we want to be able, through this regulation, to indicate the direction in which these kinds of new technologies should be innovated.
Yes, and I think when you also mention regulation specifically at the local level, I guess we also have, let's say, certain expectations of politicians or the political class in regulating this. But at the same time, do you believe that the current political class is, let's say, familiar enough with these issues to issue some really coherent and in-depth regulations, or do you think that we might need maybe new training of our politicians to better understand this?
Truly understanding sort of what the technology is and what its real challenges are is a challenge, and clearly not all politicians will have this, and to a certain extent that is, politicians are meant to reflect the population, and the population doesn't really have that kind of level of understanding yet, which is why the kind of combination of using expert groups to provide advice, of using standards communities with the technical community coming together to provide input on the details of how to do things, is probably a sensible approach to be taking in this space. But because it is challenging to understand where the real issues lie, we do find that often the main focus of the policy debate is defined basically by what are the headlines in the news, what are the issues that have attracted attention due to be it a whistleblower who has come forward with deep insights into problems in something, or be it because of the particular nature of the technology. So in that respect, for instance, we can reflect on why is it that the face recognition has attracted so much of the debate when it comes to also the implementation of the AI Act, as opposed to many of the other technologies where there is decision making happening that is impacting on people. And probably one of the reasons why face recognition is attracting so much of the attention is because it is something that we feel easily as humans as something that is touching at the way in which we operate, the way in which humans recognize each other, and as such the way in which we will be able to clearly shape the way in which we treat one person potentially differently than another person is through seeing somebody's face. and using that to recognize people. And so face recognition is easy to understand that this is something that will intrude on somebody's privacy, even though from a technical perspective, there are a lot of other means, especially when it comes to the way in which we exist on the internet, for profiling and identifying people that have already been used for a while, and that potentially even work more reliably, more efficiently than face recognition does.
Thank you. And just a final question to wrap it up a bit, because you did mention, I guess, the way that people feel about this, and it's also very much influenced by mass media. And I was wondering, do you believe that it is possible that in the future maybe people in Europe will become less skeptical towards facial recognition technology and embrace it more widely, like people, let's say, in China, to make a small generalization, do? Do you believe that this attitude could shift towards a more positive outlook?
It is certainly possible that the outlook could shift in that direction. It could also shift in the opposite direction. I think a question is whether we feel that it ought to shift or not. From my point of view, the current perspective is probably fairly good in the sense that it is taking a critical perspective, but it isn't rejecting it outright. It is basically one of, okay, show me what the actual benefit is that this technology is going to give before I start using it. Potentially what we need a bit more is explain to me clearly what the potential risks are that come with using this kind of technology. Overall, it is possible to shift the way in which people will perceive this technology, basically by the way in which the headline articles around these kinds of things, what it is that you're being exposed to in this space, and which is why a different kind of technology, recommender systems, the things that determine what is the sort of high on your search results, etc., are an important part of maintaining a good democratic society.
So I guess because you were mentioning the differences between cultures and, say, politics, and how that shapes, I guess, the approach that states have towards these technologies and regulating them, do you believe that the way to overcome these existing differences would be by, let's say, implementing some common industrial standards for the companies?
So standards is definitely an area where there is a lot of effort being made to maintain international cohesion. We see this, for instance, by the fact that most national standards bodies are focusing their work at the international level with the ISO, IEC initiatives around AI standards. However, standards can only go to a certain extent. What the standard really does is it provides a process that you should be following, or it provides a particular kind of way in which to assess the kind of technology, the outcomes, a risk assessment or risk management kind of standard, for instance. But this is purely sort of the procedural aspect to it. There is a need for having government regulation that establishes what the ultimate outcomes are that you need to be showing, that can set what does compliance actually mean, because the standard is always a voluntary kind of process. It's a tool for either for self-regulation or for just showing or giving you a guarantee as to that you're following best practices. It does not in itself define something that will give a guarantee towards the public that everybody is following this.
Thank you. And do you believe that the ideal scenario would then be one where we have both the industrial standards, which might not necessarily be that strong, but also carry some sort of importance, as you mentioned, and also have governmental or maybe global standards in a way?
Ideally, we would find some way of establishing a global baseline for sort of minimum requirements. Building on that, we can have culturally dependent additional requirements that are set by government. That way providing guarantees for their citizens that these are actually being used. And all of this is supported by standards that really provide the detailed guidance on how to do these kinds of things. And then between countries, or especially from the point of view of companies or organizations that are using these technologies, to help them in their coordination between things, they can again be using standards with, that can be built into contractual agreements.
Thank you.